There is a reason a cheap steak can look perfectly good in the package and still turn into something you have to fight with at the dinner table. You buy the cheaper cut because the price makes sense. You bring it home, season it, put it in a hot pan, and 5 minutes later you are chewing the same piece of beef you could have bought for half the price of a restaurant meal. Then you hear about baking soda, a little white powder, 15 or 20 minutes, rinse it off, cook the beef, and suddenly people are claiming that inexpensive beef can become tender enough to compete with much more expensive cuts. I have spent enough time around beef to know that whenever somebody says a kitchen trick can completely transform meat, there is usually a little truth mixed with a little exaggeration. So let's separate the two, because baking soda really can change the texture of beef, but it does not perform magic, and if you use it on the wrong piece of meat, you can end up disappointed. The interesting part is why it works, how much you actually need, and where the trick stops working. The first thing you need to understand is that not every tough piece of beef is tough for the same reason. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. Take an inexpensive steak from the chuck, round, flank, or skirt. Some of these cuts have long muscle fibers, some have more connective tissue, some are simply leaner and lose moisture quickly when you cook them. If you treat all of them exactly like a ribeye, you are asking the meat to behave in a way it was never designed to behave. And that is where most people go wrong. They think tenderness comes from the seasoning. It doesn't. Pepper does not tenderize a steak. Garlic does not tenderize a steak. A fancy steak rub does not magically change the structure of the muscle. What matters is what you do to that meat before and during cooking. This is something an old butcher once explained to me in the simplest possible way. He said, "Stop trying to make every piece of beef become a ribeye." That stuck with me, because the goal is not to turn a cheap cut into something it isn't. The goal is to make that particular cut eat as well as it possibly can, and baking soda has a very specific job. It changes the surface environment of the meat. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, and it is alkaline. When you put a small amount on raw beef, it raises the pH at the surface. That matters because muscle proteins behave differently in that environment. During cooking, proteins tighten and contract. As they tighten, they can squeeze moisture out of the meat. A higher pH surface can reduce some of that tightening, allowing the meat to hold on to more moisture. That is the basic reason the technique can make beef feel softer and juicier. Notice what I did not say. I did not say baking soda dissolves all the tough connective tissue. It doesn't. I did not say it magically breaks down the entire steak. It doesn't. And I definitely did not say you can cover a thick chuck steak in baking soda, wait 15 minutes, and suddenly have a ribeye. That is where the internet version gets carried away. The effect is strongest near the surface. That makes the technique particularly useful when the beef is thinly sliced. Think about stir-fry beef. You slice the meat thin across the grain, and now almost the entire piece is close to the surface. That is exactly the situation where a small amount of baking soda can make a noticeable difference. But if you have a thick steak sitting on your cutting board, the middle of that steak is still the middle of that steak. The baking soda is not traveling through the entire piece. That distinction is important. Now let's talk about the amount. You do not need to bury the meat under a mountain of white powder. For about 1 pound of beef, the method described here uses roughly 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Spread it evenly over the surface, rub it in lightly, and then comes the part people mess up. Time. For thin pieces, give it roughly 15 to 30 minutes. You do not need to leave it sitting around all afternoon, and I would not treat longer as automatically better. This is one of those kitchen tricks where more is not the answer. The goal is to change the surface of the meat, not to make the meat taste like the inside of a box of baking soda. And that brings us to the rinse. After the treatment, rinse the beef thoroughly under cold running water. You want the slippery baking soda residue gone. Then dry the meat completely with paper towels. This step is not cosmetic. It matters. If you leave a noticeable amount of baking soda on the surface, The beef can develop an unpleasant, dull, almost soapy character when it cooks. And then somebody tries the trick, decides it ruined the steak, and tells everyone baking soda doesn't work. The technique wasn't necessarily the problem. The excess powder was. There is another reason drying matters. If you put wet beef into a hot pan, you are fighting for browning. The surface has to lose that moisture before it can brown properly. So after rinsing, dry it thoroughly, then cook it. But here is the question I always want to ask before somebody reaches for the baking soda. What cut are you actually holding? Because sometimes baking soda is not the best answer. If I have a thin piece of beef that I need on the table quickly, I might use it. If I have a Sunday afternoon and a tougher cut with plenty of connective tissue, I would rather use thyme and moisture. That is a completely different process. Take chuck, brisket, shank, short rib, or oxtail. These cuts contain connective tissue that benefits from long, gentle cooking. Brown the meat first, then put it into a covered pot with enough liquid to keep the cooking environment moist. Around 300 degrees Fahrenheit in the oven for several hours is the kind of approach that makes sense for those cuts. Why? Because collagen behaves differently when it is given enough time in a moist cooking environment. Instead of trying to make a tough cut behave like a quick cooking steak, you let the connective tissue gradually soften and turn into gelatin. That is why a properly braised chuck roast can fall apart, while a quickly grilled chuck steak can come out tough. Same animal, different approach. That is the lesson. The cheap cut is not necessarily the bad cut. Sometimes it is simply the wrong cut for the cooking method you chose. And there is another trick that costs you absolutely nothing. Look at the direction of the muscle fibers. You can often see lines running through the surface of the beef. Those lines tell you which direction the fibers are running. Your knife should cut across those fibers, not along them. Think about a piece of rope. If you hand somebody a long piece of rope and ask them to chew through it, you are giving their teeth a difficult job. But cut that rope into tiny pieces first, and the job becomes much easier. Muscle fibers work on the same basic principle. Cutting across the grain shortens the fibers your teeth have to deal with, and that means a cheap steak can become noticeably easier to chew without a single chemical treatment. It takes seconds, no special equipment, no expensive marinade, just paying attention to the meat. There is another old school approach that works for certain cuts too: mechanical tenderizing. A simple meat mallet can physically break down some of the long muscle fibers. You place the beef on a board, cover it so you do not send meat particles across the kitchen, and gently work the surface with the mallet. The goal is not to destroy the steak. You are trying to interrupt the structure that makes it difficult to chew. Commercial cube steaks are made using a similar principle, except the machine does the work with blades. But there is an important food safety issue here. When you mechanically pierce the surface of beef, material from the outside can be pushed into the interior. That means you should pay attention to the package instructions when buying mechanically tenderized beef. Do not assume mechanically tenderized meat should automatically be treated like an intact steak. The label matters. Now let's come back to the baking soda experiment. Suppose you have 1 pound of inexpensive beef. You slice it thinly, you add about 1 teaspoon of baking soda, you spread it evenly, you give it around 20 minutes, then you rinse it thoroughly and dry it. What should you expect? A softer texture. That is the honest answer. You should not expect a completely different flavor. In fact, one of the biggest limitations of this trick is that tenderness and flavor are two different problems. Baking soda can help with texture. It does not create marbling. It does not create the rich flavor you get from a well-marbled steak. It does not age the beef. It does not turn chuck into ribeye, and it does not replace good cooking. That is why I would never tell somebody to use baking soda on every piece of beef they buy. Use it when the situation calls for it. If you are making a quick stir fry on a weeknight, it can be a useful tool. If you are cooking a thin, inexpensive cut and want to improve the texture quickly, it can make sense. But if you have a thick roast and several hours available, there are better methods. Salt is another one. A proper salt treatment does something baking soda doesn't. Salt seasons the meat, and with enough time, salt can move beyond the surface while changing how the muscle holds moisture. For a steak, salting ahead of time and leaving it uncovered in the refrigerator can also help dry the surface, which is useful when you want strong browning. The trade-off is time. Baking soda can be a short process. Salt needs patience. Braising needs even more patience. Dry aging takes longer still. Every method has a price. Sometimes the price is money. Sometimes it is time. Sometimes it is attention. The smart cook learns to choose the method based on the day. If it is 6 in the evening and dinner needs to happen soon, you are not going to start a 3-day project. That is when a quick technique earns its place. But if you have the afternoon, a tough connective tissue-rich cut can give you something baking soda never will. Deep flavor, rich gelatin, that slow-cooked texture that makes the cheapest cuts some of the most satisfying beef on the table. This is also why I don't like the idea that expensive steaks are automatically better. There are things a ribeye does beautifully: high heat, short cooking, simple seasoning. That marbled fat does a lot of the work. But the animal did not only produce ribeyes. There are many other muscles in that animal. Some are inexpensive because shoppers overlook them. Some are inexpensive because they require more knowledge. And some are inexpensive because they simply need more time. That is a very different thing from being bad meat. If your grocery budget is getting squeezed, learning those differences can matter. You do not have to buy the most expensive steak every time you want beef. You have to stop expecting every cut to respond to the same treatment. And this is where the baking soda trick becomes useful, not as a miracle, as a tool, a very specific tool. Thin beef, quick cooking, texture improvement, small amount, short treatment, thorough rinse, good drying, then proper cooking. That's the entire idea. And there is one more thing I would change before you even touch the baking soda. Change the way you shop. Don't stand at the meat case looking only at the price per pound. Look at the cut. Look at the grain. Look at the amount of connective tissue. Think about what you are cooking that night. If you are making a fast stir fry, buy something you can slice thinly. If you have hours, look at chuck or another cut that benefits from slow cooking. If you want burgers, you can even buy a whole chuck roast and grind it yourself if you have the equipment. Now you control the meat and the fat instead of paying for a premium label. That is how a butcher thinks, not which package is the most expensive. The question is, what am I cooking and which piece of the animal is built for that job? That question can save you a lot more money than any viral kitchen trick. So if you have a cheap steak sitting in your refrigerator tonight, don't automatically assume you made a bad purchase. Look at the grain, decide how thick it is, decide how much time you have. If it is thin and you need dinner quickly, about 1 teaspoon of baking soda per pound, around 20 minutes, followed by a thorough cold water rinse and complete drying, is a reasonable experiment. If it is thick, don't expect baking soda to transform the center. And if it is a cut packed with connective tissue, give it what it really wants: low heat, moisture, time. That's the part people forget. The best butcher trick is not knowing one secret ingredient. It is knowing which tool belongs with which piece of meat. Try the baking soda method on a small batch before you commit your whole dinner to it. Then taste the difference for yourself. And if you have an old family method for making an inexpensive cut tender, tell me what the cut is, what you do to it, and how long you cook it. Those are the techniques worth keeping. Because the next time you stand in front of the meat counter and see an expensive steak beside a much cheaper cut, you may look at that cheaper package differently. And there is a good chance you should, because sometimes the difference between tough beef and great beef is not the price tag. It is knowing what that piece of meat needs. But there is another mistake I see people make all the time, and it has nothing to do with baking soda. They buy a cheap steak, tenderize it, season it, and then put it into a pan that isn't hot enough. That undoes a lot of the work. You want the surface of the beef to meet serious heat quickly, not because high heat magically tenderizes meat, but because you want browning before the inside has a chance to overcook. That brown crust is where a lot of the flavor comes from. And remember, baking soda is not giving you that flavor. It is helping with texture. You still have to cook the meat properly. This is why I always separate tenderness into two different questions. First, how easy is this beef to chew? Second, how good does this beef taste? Those are not the same thing. You can make meat softer and still have a disappointing dinner. That is exactly why I would never use baking soda as an excuse to ignore seasoning, browning, slicing, or cooking temperature. Think of it as one adjustment in a much bigger process. There is also a simple experiment you can do at home if you want to understand this for yourself. Take 2 equal pieces of inexpensive beef, leave one completely untreated, treat the other with the baking soda method, keep everything else the same pan, same heat, same cooking time, same seasoning after rinsing. Then cut both pieces across the grain and taste them side by side. Don't ask yourself which one looks prettier. Ask which one is easier to chew. That is where you will notice the difference. And if the difference is small, don't force yourself to believe the trick worked. That is another lesson worth remembering. A cooking technique doesn't become good because somebody on the internet says it works. It becomes useful when it solves a real problem in your kitchen. For some cuts, the difference will be obvious. For others, it may barely matter. Thickness changes the result. Cut changes the result. Slicing changes the result. Cooking changes the result. Even the amount of baking soda changes the result. That's why blindly copying a viral video is not the same thing as understanding the technique. You need to know what the technique is actually doing. And once you understand that, you can make your own decision. There is one more reason thin slicing matters so much. When you cut beef across the grain into thin strips, you are already doing part of the tenderizing work before the meat ever touches the pan. The baking soda then helps the surface retain moisture during cooking. Those two things work together. But if you slice with the grain, you are handing your teeth long muscle fibers. No amount of clever seasoning changes that basic structure. So before reaching for anything in your pantry, take 5 seconds and look at the steak. Find the grain. Turn your knife against it. Long may be the most underrated tenderizing technique in your kitchen because it costs absolutely nothing. And if you have a tough cut that is meant for slow cooking, don't fight it. That's where people make another expensive mistake. They see a cheap chuck roast and try to cook it like a steak because they want dinner quickly. Then they decide the meat was bad. The meat wasn't bad. The cooking method was wrong. Chuck has a job. Those muscles work hard on the animal, which is why they contain more connective tissue. But that connective tissue is not your enemy. Given enough time and moisture, it becomes one of the reasons the meat tastes so rich. This is why a slow braise can turn a relatively inexpensive piece of beef into something that tastes like it belongs in a much more expensive meal. You are not making the meat expensive. You are learning how to use it. That's the real money-saving trick. And it changes the way you should look at the meat counter. Instead of asking, what's the best steak here? Ask, what am I making tonight? If the answer is fajitas, you need one kind of beef. If the answer is stir fry, you need another approach. If the answer is pot roast, you should be looking at completely different muscles. If the answer is burgers, you can think about fat content and grinding. The same animal gives you all of those possibilities. You just have to stop treating every piece of beef like it belongs on the same grill grate. Now, if you're using baking soda for a quick meal, keep the process simple. Measure it, spread it evenly. Don't leave thick piles of powder sitting on the meat. Give it the appropriate amount of time. Rinse it thoroughly, dry it thoroughly, then cook it with enough heat to brown the surface. And don't forget the final cut. Slice across the grain. That last step is easy to skip because the steak already looks cooked and ready to eat, but it can make a noticeable difference in the bite. You can have the same piece of beef cooked to the same internal doneness and get two completely different eating experiences simply by changing the direction of the knife. That's not a gimmick. That's understanding muscle. And once you understand muscle, cheap beef becomes much less intimidating. There is another thing I want you to remember when you see those viral videos. A dramatic before and after is designed to make you think the ingredient did everything. Usually it didn't. The person may have sliced the beef thin. They may have cut across the grain. They may have used high heat. They may have rinsed the meat. They may have cooked it with a sauce. All of those things matter. The powder gets the attention because it makes the best thumbnail, but the real technique is the entire process. That's why I don't want you walking away from this thinking baking soda makes cheap steak taste expensive. That's too simple. The better lesson is this. Baking soda can help certain inexpensive beef become more tender, especially when the meat is thinly sliced. It has limits. It doesn't create flavor. It doesn't penetrate deeply into a thick steak. It doesn't replace proper slicing, and it doesn't turn every tough cut into a quick cooking steak. Once you know those limits, you can actually use it intelligently, and that is much more useful than a viral kitchen trick. So the next time you are standing in the grocery store looking at a package of expensive beef, don't automatically reach for it. Look one shelf lower. Look at the chuck, look at the round. Look at the cuts other shoppers are passing over. Then ask yourself what you have time to cook. If you have 20 minutes, choose a method built for 20 minutes. If you have 4 hours, take advantage of that time. If you have tomorrow, salt the meat today. And if you have a grinder, you can even turn an inexpensive roast into burgers with the fat level you actually want. That's how people who work around meat think. They don't see one category called good beef and another called bad beef. They see different muscles with different jobs. And when you understand the job, you can make the meat work for you. That is worth more than any bottle of expensive steak seasoning. So try the baking soda test if you have never done it, but test it honestly. Use a small batch. Keep the rest of the cooking process consistent. Taste the result, then decide whether it deserves a place in your kitchen. Because sometimes the old trick really does work. Sometimes it works only under very specific conditions. And sometimes the better answer isn't a powder at all. It's a knife. It's salt. It's time. It's low heat. Or simply choosing the right cut for the meal you are making. The butcher's secret was never one magic ingredient. It was knowing what the meat needed before putting it on the heat. And once you learn that, you can walk past the expensive steaks with a little more confidence. Because the best value in the meat case is often hiding in plain sight. And the people who know how to prepare it are the ones who get to eat well without paying the premium. If you try the baking soda method, tell me what cut you used and whether you noticed a difference. And if there is an old butcher trick your family still uses, share that too. Because some of the best meat knowledge never made it into a cookbook. It stayed behind the counter, passed from one set of hands to another. And those are the tricks